Oh, Lucy, is it?
Yes.
Hello, my name's from Chester, please. So, okay, step in 2 seconds.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Lucy Letby. Yeah, not a problem.
I'm going to put you in the back seat over here.
Hold on, man.
Yes. Okay, just take a seat in there for me, Lucy. I'll move that seat forward a bit shortly.
I've just had knee surgery.
Oh, right, okay.
She is Britain's most prolific child serial killer. A statement that shocked a nation. A nurse entrusted with caring for the most fragile lives imaginable. Tiny newborn babies fighting for survival in a neonatal unit. Parents placed their trust in her. Colleagues worked alongside her. Yet prosecutors argued that behind a calm smile and a compassionate appearance was a woman responsible for the deaths of innocent children. But not everyone agrees. There is no convincing medical evidence that these babies were murdered. Those words would ignite a fierce debate years after the verdict. One side believes justice has been served. They point to the convictions, the evidence presented in court, and the devastating losses suffered by grieving families. The other side believes serious questions remain unanswered. Questions about medical evidence. Questions about expert testimony. Questions about whether one of Britain's most shocking criminal convictions could one day be re-examined. At the center of it all stands a former neonatal nurse named Lucy Letby. A woman convicted of murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder 7 more. A woman sentenced to spend the rest of her life behind bars. And a woman whose case continues to divide doctors, lawyers, journalists, and the public unlike almost any other criminal case in modern British history. How did a nurse become the focus of one of the largest murder investigations ever conducted within the National Health Service? What really happened inside the neonatal unit of the Countess of Chester Hospital between 2015 and 2016? Were a series of tragic infant deaths the work of a calculated killer hiding in plain sight? Or has a growing controversy exposed troubling questions that refuse to go away? Today, we examine every stage of the case. The deaths, the investigation, the evidence, the trial, the convictions, and the controversy that continues to cast a shadow over everything that followed. This is the story of Lucy Letby. A story filled with tragedy, suspicion, unanswered questions, and a debate that is far from over. Welcome to Dark Crime Casefiles, where no crime stays in the dark. Before Lucy Letby became the subject of newspaper headlines, courtroom sketches, and heated public debate, she was known simply as a nurse. Long before police investigations and criminal accusations, she lived a life that appeared remarkably ordinary. Lucy Letby was born on January 4, 1990, in the city of Hereford, England. She was the only child of John and Susan Letby, a close-knit family who described their daughter as kind, intelligent, and hardworking. Friends and relatives would later recall a young woman who appeared quiet and polite. She was not known for seeking attention or causing trouble. There were no reports of a troubled childhood, no history of violence, and no obvious warning signs that would later become the subject of public scrutiny. As she grew older, Lucy developed a strong interest in healthcare and helping others. It was an ambition that would shape the course of her life. After completing her education, she enrolled at the University of Chester, where she trained to become a nurse. During her studies, she focused on neonatal care, one of the most demanding and emotionally challenging areas of nursing. Neonatal nurses work with newborn babies who are often critically ill, born prematurely, or facing life-threatening medical complications. Their patients are among the most vulnerable individuals in any hospital. The work requires patience, skill, and emotional resilience. For Lucy Letby, it appeared to be the perfect fit. After qualifying as a registered nurse, she joined the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital, a National Health Service hospital located in northwest England. The unit cared for newborn babies requiring specialized treatment and intensive medical support. Every day brought new challenges. Some babies recovered and went home with their families. Others faced uncertain futures from the moment they entered the ward. It was a place where life and death often existed side by side. By all appearances, Lucy embraced the responsibility. Colleagues described her as committed and hardworking. She regularly volunteered for additional shifts and was trusted with some of the unit's most vulnerable patients. Over time, she became an established member of the neonatal team. Hospital records showed that she pursued additional training opportunities and professional development. Supervisors viewed her as a capable nurse with a promising future. Outside of work, Lucy's life appeared equally unremarkable. She purchased her first home in Chester while still in her 20s. Friends described someone who enjoyed socializing, going out for meals, attending events, and spending time with colleagues. Like many people her age, she maintained an active presence on social media and appeared to be building a stable and successful life. Photographs from the period show smiling group gatherings, celebrations with friends, and the everyday moments that fill most people's lives. Nothing about those images suggested that within a few years, her face would appear on front pages across Britain. Nothing suggested that police detectives would spend years investigating her. Nothing suggested that grieving families would one day accuse her of committing the unthinkable. To those around her, Lucy Letby was a dedicated healthcare professional, a trusted nurse, a daughter, a friend, a colleague, and perhaps that is one of the reasons this case would capture the attention of an entire nation. Because when suspicions eventually began to emerge inside the neonatal unit, they were directed towards someone who, on the surface, seemed to be the last person anyone would suspect. At first, nobody was looking for a killer. They were simply trying to understand why babies were dying. Nobody looking at Lucy Letby in 2015 would have imagined she would later become one of the most controversial figures in British criminal history. But inside the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital, something was beginning to happen. A series of unexpected collapses, a growing sense of unease, and a question that nobody could answer. Why were babies dying? To understand what happened next, it is important to understand the environment in which these events unfolded. The neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital cared for some of the most vulnerable patients imaginable. Many of the babies admitted there had arrived in the world weeks before their due dates. Some weighed only a few pounds. Others required constant monitoring, breathing assistance, or specialist treatment to survive. For doctors and nurses working on the ward, emergencies were not unusual. Premature babies can deteriorate rapidly, and despite the best efforts of medical staff, not every life can be saved. But by 2015, the unit was facing increasing pressure. Like many hospitals across the National Health Service, resources were stretched. Staff were working long shifts. Patient numbers fluctuated. The demands placed on doctors and nurses continued to grow. Every decision carried enormous responsibility, and every mistake could have serious consequences. Despite those challenges, the neonatal unit had generally maintained a reassuring record. Unexpected deaths were relatively uncommon, and serious incidents were closely reviewed whenever they occurred. Then came June 2015. A baby boy later identified in court as Baby A was born prematurely but was showing signs of stability. Medical staff were cautiously optimistic. His parents had every reason to believe their son was receiving the care he needed. Then, without warning, his condition deteriorated. Medical staff rushed to save him. Despite their efforts, Baby A died. For his family, the loss was devastating. The death was tragic, but at the time it was not immediately viewed as suspicious. Neonatal medicine is an area where even the best outcomes cannot always be guaranteed, and doctors understood that premature infants often face serious risks. But what happened next would begin to raise questions. Just over a day after the death of Baby A, his twin sister, known in court as Baby B, suffered a sudden and unexpected collapse. Medical staff were able to save her, but the incident left doctors searching for answers. Two shocking events involving twins in such a short period of time immediately attracted attention. Yet there were still no clear explanations. As weeks passed, more incidents followed. Another baby deteriorated unexpectedly. Then another, and another. Some survived. Others did not. Each case had its own medical complexities. Each child had unique challenges. But among staff members, a troubling pattern appeared to be emerging. Experienced doctors who had spent years working in neonatal medicine began noticing that some of the collapses seemed unusual. Certain babies appeared to deteriorate without an obvious cause. In several cases, medical interventions that would normally stabilize a patient seemed ineffective. The events did not fit neatly into the explanations doctors expected to see. At first, staff searched for clinical answers. Was there an infection spreading through the unit? Had something been missed in the baby's treatment? Could equipment be malfunctioning? Was the hospital dealing with a problem nobody had yet identified? Meetings were held. Cases were reviewed. Medical notes were examined. But clear answers remained elusive. As the months progressed, the atmosphere inside the unit began to change. Doctors who had once approached each shift with confidence found themselves becoming increasingly uneasy. Nurses who were accustomed to handling medical emergencies now found themselves discussing a growing number of unexpected incidents. Every new collapse brought renewed anxiety. Every emergency call carried an added sense of dread. Families arrived expecting hope and reassurance, while behind the scenes, healthcare professionals struggled to understand what was happening around them. Shock gradually turned into concern. Concern slowly became fear. And fear created something even more dangerous. Suspicion. Nobody knew exactly what was causing the tragedies. Nobody could point to a single explanation. But by late 2015, some senior doctors had begun to believe that what they were witnessing was more than a series of unfortunate medical events. Something felt wrong. Something felt different. And as they reviewed the cases again and again, they began noticing something unsettling. A name that seemed to appear more often than anyone expected. Lucy Letby. At first, it was nothing more than an observation. No accusations. No allegations of murder. No one claimed they had identified a killer. Just a troubling detail that some members of staff found increasingly difficult to ignore. As the number of unexpected collapses and deaths continued to grow, senior doctors within the neonatal unit began reviewing individual cases more closely. They searched medical records, examined timelines, and attempted to identify anything the incidents might have had in common. The more they looked, the more concerned they became. Several consultants working within the unit would later describe growing unease about the unusual nature of the collapses. These were experienced medical professionals who had spent years caring for premature and critically ill babies. While neonatal medicine is unpredictable, they believed some of the events they were witnessing did not fit the patterns they would normally expect. Informal conversations gradually turned into serious discussions. Doctors questioned whether there might be an underlying cause they had failed to identify. Could there be a problem with equipment? An undetected infection? A flaw in hospital procedures? Or was something else happening entirely? As reviews continued, attention increasingly focused on one particular detail. Lucy Letby appeared to be present during a significant number of the incidents. It is important to understand what this observation meant at the time. For the consultants involved, it was not proof of wrongdoing. It was not evidence of murder. It was simply a correlation, an observation that seemed unusual enough to warrant further examination. In any hospital environment, nurses work numerous shifts and interact with many patients. The presence of a staff member during medical emergencies does not automatically imply responsibility. Yet as more incidents were reviewed, some doctors became increasingly concerned about how often Letby's name appeared within the timelines. The observation raised difficult questions. Was it merely coincidence? Was there another explanation hidden within the medical records? Or was the pattern pointing toward something more serious? The consultants believed those questions needed answers. As concerns intensified, discussions moved beyond the ward itself. Senior doctors approached hospital management and raised their fears about what was happening inside the neonatal unit. According to accounts later presented in court, consultants repeatedly expressed concerns regarding Lucy Letby's presence during several of the incidents. They requested further investigation and urged hospital leaders to take action. But the response they received was not what they expected. Hospital administrators were cautious. Accusing a healthcare professional of causing harm to patients is an extraordinarily serious matter, and management wanted evidence that extended beyond observations and suspicions. As a result, tensions began to develop between consultants and hospital leadership. Doctors believed immediate action was necessary. Management believed stronger evidence was required. The disagreement would become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. As the months passed, consultants continued pressing their concerns. They argued that patient safety had to come first. Management remained hesitant. Meetings were held. Emails were exchanged. Discussions became increasingly urgent. Yet the uncertainty remained. No one had definitive answers. No one had conclusive proof. But the concerns were no longer fading. They were growing stronger. Then, in July 2016, a significant decision was made. Lucy Letby was removed from clinical duties. Instead of working directly with babies in the neonatal unit, she was reassigned to an administrative role away from patient care. For some staff members, the decision brought a sense of relief. For others, it raised even more questions. What exactly had prompted the move? Was it simply a precaution? Or had hospital leaders finally begun taking the consultants' concerns seriously? At the time, very few people outside the hospital knew what was happening behind closed doors. Parents were unaware of the internal debates. The public had heard nothing. The story that would later dominate headlines across Britain was still hidden from view. But something happened after Letby was removed from the ward that would later become one of the most powerful and frequently discussed points in the entire case. The unexpected collapses stopped. Supporters of the prosecution have often pointed to this moment as one of the most significant observations in the case. They argue that after months of unexplained incidents, the removal of Lucy Letby was followed by an apparent end to the pattern that had alarmed doctors for so long. To them, the timing was impossible to ignore. Critics, however, would later argue that correlation does not automatically establish causation and that other factors within the unit also deserved scrutiny. But those debates would come years later. At the time, the consultants who had raised concerns felt that their worst fears might have been justified. The deaths had devastated families. The collapses had terrified staff. And now, for the first time in months, the pattern appeared to have stopped. What nobody knew was that the questions surrounding Lucy Letby were about to leave the hospital walls. And once the police became involved, the investigation would grow into one of the largest and most controversial criminal inquiries in modern British history. For months, concerns about the deaths and collapses had remained largely confined to the Countess of Chester Hospital. Consultants had raised alarms. Internal reviews had taken place. Discussions between doctors and management had become increasingly tense. But by 2017, hospital leaders reached a decision that would change everything. The case was referred to the police. What had begun as a medical mystery was now becoming a criminal investigation. Responsibility for uncovering the truth fell to Cheshire Police. The operation was given a name: Operation Hummingbird. At first, investigators faced a daunting challenge. Unlike traditional murder investigations, there was no obvious crime scene, no eyewitness account, no single incident that clearly pointed to criminal activity. Instead, detectives were confronted with years of complex medical records, highly specialized neonatal care, and a series of cases involving some of the most vulnerable patients imaginable. Their task was simple in theory, but enormously complicated in practice. Determine whether the deaths and collapses were the result of natural medical causes, systemic failures within the hospital, or deliberate acts carried out by an individual. To answer that question, investigators launched an extensive review. Medical experts were brought in to examine individual cases. Patient records were analyzed in extraordinary detail. Thousands of pages of documentation were collected and reviewed. Detectives worked alongside specialists to reconstruct exactly what had happened during each incident. Every note, every medication record, every nursing observation, every treatment decision. Investigators wanted to know not only how each baby had deteriorated but also whether there were similarities linking the cases together. The deeper they looked, the larger the investigation became. What initially focused on a smaller number of incidents expanded into a review covering numerous deaths and non-fatal collapses within the neonatal unit. Timelines were carefully reconstructed. Staff rotas were examined. Movements within the ward were mapped. Witness interviews were conducted. Doctors were questioned. Nurses were interviewed. Hospital administrators were asked to explain decisions that had been made years earlier. Detectives were attempting to piece together a puzzle that stretched across months of medical history. As the investigation progressed, one name remained at the center of growing scrutiny: Lucy Letby. For police, the objective was not simply to determine whether concerns raised by consultants had merit. It was to establish whether there was enough evidence to support criminal charges. The process took time. Investigators continued gathering evidence, consulting experts, and examining every possible explanation. Then, in July 2018, the investigation entered a dramatic new phase. Police arrested Lucy Letby at her home in Chester. News of the arrest spread rapidly. For the first time, the story began attracting significant public attention. A neonatal nurse suspected of harming babies was a headline almost impossible to ignore. Yet despite the arrest, the investigation continued. Letby was later released while inquiries remained ongoing, and detectives returned to the painstaking task of building their case. Further arrests followed in subsequent years as investigators continued examining evidence and consulting medical experts. With each development, public interest intensified. Questions multiplied. What evidence had police uncovered? What exactly had happened inside the neonatal unit? And how strong was the case against the nurse at the center of the investigation? Among the most significant moments came during searches conducted at Lucy Letby's home. Detectives seized a wide range of materials: documents, personal notes, work-related paperwork, electronic devices, mobile phones, computers, storage media. Investigators examined years of information, searching for anything that might help explain the events that had unfolded inside the hospital. As they reviewed the material, police believed they were uncovering evidence that strengthened their suspicions. Some items appeared unusual. Others raised new questions. Together, they became part of a growing body of evidence that investigators believed could help explain what had happened. But among everything recovered during the investigation, one discovery stood out above all others: a collection of handwritten notes. Words written by Lucy Letby herself. Words that prosecutors would later argue revealed a deeply troubling state of mind. Words that supporters of the conviction would describe as devastating evidence. And words that critics would later insist had been taken entirely out of context. Years later, those notes would remain one of the most fiercely debated pieces of evidence in the entire case. And investigators were about to place them at the center of their argument. The case against Lucy Letby was not built around a single piece of evidence. There was no CCTV footage showing an attack. No eyewitness claiming to have seen her deliberately harm a baby. No recorded confession. Instead, prosecutors presented what they described as a compelling combination of medical evidence, expert testimony, documents, digital records, and patterns they believed pointed to one conclusion. According to the prosecution, when all of the evidence was viewed together, it revealed a nurse who had been harming babies while working inside the neonatal unit. The defense strongly disagreed. But before a jury could decide who was right, they first had to examine the evidence itself. One piece at a time. Among the most widely discussed discoveries were the handwritten notes found during searches of Lucy Letby's home. Some appeared to contain expressions of distress, self-doubt, and emotional turmoil. Others contained phrases that would later become central to the prosecution's case. One note included the words, "I am evil." Another contained the phrase, "I did this." To many people following the case, the words seemed shocking. Why would an innocent person write such things? Prosecutors argued that the notes reflected a guilty conscience. They suggested the writings revealed an awareness of responsibility for the deaths and collapses that had occurred within the neonatal unit. The defense offered a very different interpretation. They argued that the notes were written during a period of intense emotional pressure after Letby had been removed from the ward and become the focus of serious allegations. According to the defense, the writings reflected anxiety, despair, and the psychological impact of being blamed for tragic events rather than an admission of guilt. Years later, those notes remain among the most debated pieces of evidence in the entire case. For some observers, they appear deeply incriminating. For others, they are evidence only of a person under extraordinary stress. The jury would ultimately have to decide how much weight to give them. But the handwritten notes were only one part of a much larger case. Perhaps the most significant medical evidence presented at trial involved two babies whose blood test results suggested the presence of insulin levels far beyond what doctors would normally expect. To understand why prosecutors considered this so important, it helps to understand one simple fact. Insulin lowers blood sugar. The human body naturally produces insulin, but when excessive insulin enters the bloodstream, blood sugar levels can fall to dangerous levels. According to the prosecution, laboratory results from two babies showed unusually high insulin readings that could not be easily explained by natural causes. Prosecutors argued that the findings indicated insulin had been administered deliberately. If true, it would suggest intentional harm rather than a medical complication. Unlike some other allegations in the case, the insulin evidence was presented as scientific data derived from laboratory testing. For prosecutors, this became one of the strongest pillars supporting their argument that the collapses were not simply the result of illness or hospital failures. The defense challenged aspects of the interpretation and questioned whether the evidence established who, if anyone, had administered insulin. But prosecutors maintained that the results pointed toward deliberate poisoning. Another major component of the prosecution's case involved allegations that air had been intentionally introduced into babies' bodies. This theory became known as the air embolism allegation. An air embolism occurs when air enters the circulatory system in a way that can interfere with normal blood flow. In severe cases, it can be life-threatening. Prosecution experts argued that several babies displayed symptoms consistent with air embolism. According to their interpretation, some of the sudden and unexplained collapses could be explained by the deliberate injection of air. Jurors heard expert testimony describing unusual clinical signs that prosecutors believed supported this theory. The defense disputed these conclusions and argued that alternative medical explanations existed. Nevertheless, the prosecution maintained that the pattern of collapses, combined with expert analysis, supported their allegation that air had been used as a method of harm. The trial also explored Lucy Letby's online activity. Investigators discovered that she had searched for parents of some of the babies on Facebook. In today's world, social media searches are common and often harmless. However, prosecutors argued that the frequency and timing of some of these searches were significant. Several occurred after incidents involving babies and sometimes long after the events themselves. Prosecutors suggested that these searches demonstrated an unusual interest in families connected to the cases. The defense countered that curiosity alone is not evidence of murder and that healthcare workers sometimes remember patients and families long after treatment has ended. On its own, the Facebook evidence was unlikely to determine the outcome of the trial. But prosecutors argued that it formed part of a broader pattern of behavior that jurors should consider alongside everything else. Another major theme throughout the trial involved Lucy Letby's presence during the collapses themselves. As investigators reconstructed timelines and reviewed staffing records, they found that Letby had been on duty during numerous incidents examined by the prosecution. This observation had first raised concerns among consultants years earlier. By the time the case reached court, it had become a central part of the prosecution's narrative. Prosecutors argued that the pattern was too striking to dismiss as coincidence. The defense responded that neonatal nurses naturally spend significant amounts of time caring for the sickest babies and that staffing records alone could not establish criminal conduct. The jury again faced a difficult question. Was the pattern meaningful evidence? Or was it a correlation that appeared suspicious only after attention had focused on a particular individual? To help answer such questions, prosecutors relied heavily on medical experts. These experts played a crucial role throughout the trial. They reviewed records, analyzed clinical data, examined treatment decisions, and provided opinions regarding what they believed had caused the baby's collapses. Several prosecution experts concluded that natural medical explanations could not adequately account for certain incidents. In their view, some collapses were consistent with deliberate harm. Their testimony formed the foundation upon which much of the prosecution's case rested. The defense challenged many of those conclusions, arguing that medicine is rarely absolute and that alternative explanations had not been fully explored. But prosecutors maintained that the expert evidence, when combined with the broader pattern of events, pointed toward a clear and disturbing conclusion. By the time the investigation had been transformed into a courtroom battle, the prosecution had assembled a case built from numerous pieces: handwritten notes, laboratory findings, medical opinions, staffing records, digital evidence, and the tragic stories of babies whose lives had ended far too soon. Individually, each piece would be scrutinized. Together, prosecutors argued, they revealed something far more sinister. After years of investigation, prosecutors believed they had enough evidence to prove that a neonatal nurse had become a serial killer. Now, it was time to present that case before a jury. In October 2022, one of the most closely watched criminal trials in modern British history began. The proceedings would last for months. The evidence would span years. And the allegations at the center of the case were almost impossible to comprehend. A neonatal nurse accused of murdering babies entrusted to her care. The trial took place at Manchester Crown Court under intense media scrutiny. Journalists filled court benches. News organizations provided daily coverage. Across Britain, people followed developments with a mixture of shock, sadness, and disbelief. For many observers, the case seemed almost unimaginable. Hospitals are places where lives are saved. Nurses are people society trusts. The idea that a healthcare professional could be deliberately harming newborn babies challenged some of the most basic assumptions people hold about those responsible for caring for the vulnerable. As proceedings unfolded, jurors were introduced to a vast amount of evidence. Medical records, expert testimony, hospital documentation, digital evidence, witness statements, timelines, laboratory results, and detailed accounts relating to each baby included in the case. The scale of the trial reflected the complexity of the allegations. Every incident was examined individually. Every claim was challenged. Every detail was scrutinized. The prosecution's task was straightforward in principle, though enormous in practice. They needed to convince the jury that the collapses and deaths were not tragic medical events, unfortunate coincidences, or failures within an overstretched hospital. They needed to prove they were crimes. According to prosecutors, Lucy Letby had exploited her position as a neonatal nurse to deliberately harm babies under her care. They argued that she used various methods to attack vulnerable infants while disguising those actions as natural medical emergencies. The prosecution pointed to the pattern of collapses, the medical evidence, the insulin cases, the air embolism allegations, the handwritten notes, and Letby's repeated presence during incidents they considered suspicious. Their argument was that the evidence, viewed as a whole, revealed a consistent and disturbing pattern. This was not chance. This was not bad luck. This was not a struggling hospital unit experiencing a period of unusually poor outcomes. According to prosecutors, it was the deliberate work of one individual. The defense presented a dramatically different narrative. They argued that the prosecution's case relied heavily on assumptions, hindsight, and disputed medical interpretations. According to the defense, the babies involved in the case were already vulnerable patients facing significant medical challenges. Prematurity, infections, congenital conditions, complications associated with neonatal care. The defense argued that the prosecution had transformed tragic outcomes into criminal allegations without proving that crimes had actually occurred. They challenged expert testimony. They questioned conclusions drawn from medical records. They disputed the interpretation of the handwritten notes. and they argued that being present during medical emergencies was entirely consistent with Letby's role as a nurse working in a busy neonatal unit. Their position was clear. Lucy Letby was not a murderer. She was being blamed for events she did not cause. As the months passed, jurors listened to both sides present their arguments in extraordinary detail. Then came one of the most anticipated moments of the entire trial. Lucy Letby herself took the witness stand. 4 days, she answered questions from both the defense and prosecution. The jury observed her closely. The public followed every report. And the woman at the center of the allegations finally had an opportunity to speak directly about the accusations against her. Letby denied harming any baby. She denied deliberately causing collapses. She denied murdering infants. When questioned about the handwritten notes found in her home, she described them as expressions of emotional distress written during a period when she felt overwhelmed and blamed for events she had not caused. At times, her testimony was emotional. At other moments, it became confrontational. She challenged suggestions that she had intentionally harmed patients and repeatedly maintained her innocence. For supporters of the prosecution, her explanations were unconvincing. For supporters of the defense, her testimony reflected the desperation of an innocent woman facing allegations of unimaginable severity. Ultimately, however, the decision would not belong to commentators, journalists, or the public. It would belong to the jury. After hearing months of evidence, jurors retired to begin deliberations. The process was lengthy. The allegations were numerous. The evidence was complex. Every charge required careful consideration. Every verdict carried enormous consequences. Families waited. Lawyers waited. The media waited. And at the center of it all sat Lucy Letby, waiting to learn whether she would spend the rest of her life as a free woman or as a convicted murderer. Then, in August 2023, the verdicts began to arrive. One by one, decisions were announced in court. The jury found Lucy Letby guilty of murdering 7 babies. They also found her guilty of attempting to murder several others. As the verdicts were read, years of investigation, legal argument, and emotional testimony reached their dramatic conclusion. For the families of the victims, the verdicts represented justice after years of grief and uncertainty. For prosecutors, they confirmed the case they had spent years building. For many members of the public, the outcome appeared definitive. The woman once described as a trusted neonatal nurse had now been convicted of some of the most serious crimes imaginable. Days later, attention turned to sentencing. The judge delivered one of the harshest punishments available under British law. Lucy Letby received multiple whole-life orders, a sentence reserved for the most serious offenders. Unlike standard life sentences, a whole-life order means a person will spend the remainder of their life in prison without the possibility of release. The sentence reflected the court's view of the gravity of the crimes. Across Britain, reaction was immediate. Newspapers carried the story on their front pages. Television networks devoted extensive coverage to the verdicts. Politicians commented. Medical institutions faced renewed scrutiny. And the public struggled to comprehend how a nurse working within a neonatal unit could have become the central figure in one of the most shocking criminal cases the country had ever seen. To many people, the story appeared finished. The investigation was complete. The trial was over. The jury had spoken. Justice had been delivered. But as the dust began to settle, something unexpected started to happen. Questions that had once seemed answered began to resurface. And a growing number of voices would soon challenge the very foundations of the case itself. In the weeks following the sentencing, the case appeared settled. The investigation had lasted years. The trial had stretched across months. The jury had heard extensive evidence. And the court had delivered its verdict. For many people, there was nothing left to discuss. Lucy Letby had been convicted of murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder others. She had received multiple whole-life orders. The criminal justice system had reached its conclusion. The story, it seemed, was over. As expected, Letby's legal team sought to challenge the outcome. Appeals were filed. Arguments were presented before senior judges. The defense attempted to overturn the convictions and secure a fresh examination of the evidence. But the appeals were unsuccessful. The courts rejected the challenges. The convictions remained in place. For supporters of the verdict, this only strengthened confidence in the outcome. Not only had a jury found Letby guilty after months of testimony, but appeal judges had also declined to overturn the decision. To many observers, the legal process had worked exactly as intended. The investigation had been exhaustive. The trial had been thorough. The verdicts had been tested. And the convictions had survived. Public opinion reflected that belief. Newspapers described Lucy Letby as Britain's most prolific child serial killer. Television documentaries examined the crimes. Books were proposed. Experts discussed the case as though it had already entered criminal history. The wider public largely accepted that the mystery had been solved. The babies had received justice. The offender was behind bars. And the nation could finally move forward. For a brief period, that appeared to be the consensus. The case was closed. Or so it seemed. Because while most people believed the story had reached its final chapter, a very different conversation was beginning to emerge behind the scenes. At first, the voices were few. A handful of doctors. Some statisticians. Several journalists. A small number of legal commentators. They were not arguing that the deaths were any less tragic. They were not questioning the suffering of the families. Instead, they were asking something far more controversial. Had the evidence been interpreted correctly? As those questions began to circulate, more experts started examining the case for themselves. Medical records were reviewed. Trial testimony was scrutinized. Scientific conclusions were challenged. And what began as isolated doubts slowly evolved into a growing debate. A debate that would spread far beyond the courtroom. A debate that would divide medical professionals, legal experts, journalists, and members of the public. A debate that continues to this day. Because after the conviction, something unexpected happened. Instead of ending the story, the verdict may have started an entirely new chapter. And that chapter would transform the Lucy Letby case from one of Britain's most shocking criminal convictions into one of its most controversial. For years, the Lucy Letby case appeared settled. A jury had reached its verdict. Appeals had failed. The convictions remained in place. Yet as more experts began examining the evidence independently, a surprising development emerged. Some of the strongest criticism of the case was not coming from internet conspiracy theorists or anonymous commentators. It was coming from professionals, doctors, researchers, statisticians, journalists, people who had spent years working in fields directly connected to the evidence presented at trial. And many of them were asking the same question. What if the evidence was not as clear-cut as it first appeared? Among the most vocal critics were neonatal specialists. These were doctors with extensive experience caring for premature and critically ill newborns, the very type of patients at the center of the case. Several argued that some of the medical conclusions presented during the trial were open to interpretation. They pointed out that neonatal medicine is highly complex and that vulnerable babies can deteriorate unexpectedly for many reasons. According to these critics, some of the collapses and deaths may have had natural medical explanations that were not fully explored during the prosecution's case. At the same time, statisticians also began examining the evidence. They questioned whether the apparent patterns identified within staffing records were as significant as they appeared. Critics argued that human beings naturally search for patterns after tragic events occur and that identifying a correlation does not necessarily establish a cause. Some suggested that once investigators focused on Lucy Letby, there was a risk that evidence would be viewed through a particular lens. Others disagreed strongly and maintained that the overall pattern remained deeply concerning. The debate quickly spread beyond academic circles. Investigative journalists began publishing detailed examinations of the case. Long-form articles appeared. Podcasts dedicated entire seasons to analyzing the evidence. Legal commentators questioned aspects of the investigation and trial. What had once seemed like a closed case was becoming the subject of an increasingly public dispute. Then came one of the most significant developments of all. An international panel of experts led by retired Canadian neonatologist Professor Shu Lee conducted a detailed review of the medical evidence. Professor Lee was not an obscure figure within neonatal medicine. He had spent decades studying newborn care and had contributed to research frequently referenced throughout the field. The panel examined multiple cases that had played a major role in the prosecution's argument. Their conclusions attracted worldwide attention. According to the panel, they found no convincing medical evidence that the babies reviewed had been murdered. Instead, they argued that alternative explanations existed for many of the incidents. In their assessment, factors such as prematurity, infection, complications of neonatal care, and other medical conditions could potentially explain events that prosecutors had presented as evidence of deliberate harm. The findings immediately reignited debate. Supporters of the convictions pointed out that the panel had not heard the entire body of evidence presented to the jury. Critics argued that experienced medical experts were raising serious questions about the foundation of the prosecution's case. Suddenly, a case that many believed had been settled was once again making international headlines. As scrutiny intensified, attention turned towards several key pieces of evidence presented at trial. One area of debate involved statistical interpretation. Critics questioned whether the significance of certain patterns had been overstated. Others maintained that the patterns were too striking to dismiss as coincidence. Another area of disagreement involved medical interpretation. Certain symptoms and clinical findings presented as evidence of deliberate harm were viewed differently by experts reviewing the case after the trial. Some argued that alternative medical explanations remained plausible. Others maintained that the original conclusions remained sound. There were also discussions surrounding aspects of the evidence that were later corrected or clarified after the trial. Supporters of the convictions argued that such corrections did not undermine the overall case. Critics argued that even seemingly small inaccuracies could become important when evaluating complex medical evidence. What became increasingly clear was that experts examining the same information were sometimes reaching very different conclusions. That reality transformed the debate. The question was no longer simply whether Lucy Letby had been convicted. The question was whether the evidence supporting those convictions was as robust as many people initially believed. Meanwhile, attention was also shifting toward the hospital itself. A separate police investigation known as Operation Duet began examining the actions of senior hospital leaders and managers connected to events surrounding the neonatal unit. The focus was different from Operation Hummingbird. Operation Hummingbird investigated whether crimes had been committed against babies. Operation Duet examined decisions made by hospital leadership and whether any actions or failures by individuals within management warranted criminal investigation. For some observers, the existence of Operation Duet raised important questions about the hospital environment. Could systemic problems have contributed to the events that occurred? Were warning signs missed? Were concerns handled appropriately? However, it is important to understand what Operation Duet does not establish. The investigation into hospital leadership does not automatically prove Lucy Letby's innocence. Nor does it automatically strengthen the case against her. The two issues are related but separate. A hospital can have management failures while a crime still occurs. Equally, concerns about hospital leadership can prompt broader questions about how events were interpreted. The significance of Operation Duet remains a subject of ongoing discussion. At the same time, efforts to challenge the convictions continued. Attention increasingly focused on the Criminal Cases Review Commission, often referred to as the CCRC. The CCRC is an independent body responsible for reviewing potential miscarriages of justice in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Its role is not to determine guilt or innocence. Instead, it examines whether there may be grounds for a conviction to be reconsidered by the courts. Lucy Letby's legal team has sought to bring new evidence and expert opinions before the commission. Supporters of these efforts argue that fresh medical analysis warrants further review. Supporters of the convictions argue that multiple courts have already considered challenges to the verdicts and that the jury's conclusions should stand. As of today, Lucy Letby remains convicted. Her convictions remain in force. Her whole life orders remain in place. No court has overturned the verdicts. Yet despite that reality, the debate surrounding the case continues to grow. What began as one of Britain's most shocking murder investigations has evolved into something else entirely. A battle over evidence. A battle over science. A battle over interpretation. And perhaps most importantly, a battle over one question that remains fiercely contested. Was justice done? Or could one of the most controversial criminal cases in modern British history still have another chapter left to be written? That question sits at the heart of the Lucy Letby case. Years after the convictions, despite countless headlines, legal proceedings, expert reviews, and public debate, the central mystery remains deeply contested. For some, the answer is clear. For others, it is anything but. Those who believe Lucy Letby is guilty point first to the verdicts themselves. After one of the longest and most complex criminal trials in recent British history, a jury heard months of evidence and found her guilty of murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder several others. Jurors examined medical records, expert testimony, staffing data, laboratory findings, handwritten notes, and witness accounts before reaching their conclusions. Those verdicts were not delivered quickly. They followed extensive deliberations and careful consideration of an enormous volume of evidence. Supporters of the convictions also point to the fact that the verdicts survived legal challenges. Appeals were pursued. Arguments were presented before senior judges. Yet the convictions remained in place. For many people, that matters. The justice system did not simply reach a conclusion once and move on. The verdicts were tested. And they stood. Many also highlight the insulin evidence presented during the trial. According to prosecutors, laboratory results suggested that 2 babies had received insulin in circumstances that could not be explained naturally. For supporters of the verdict, this evidence remains one of the strongest indicators that deliberate harm occurred. Others point to the broader circumstantial picture presented in court. The repeated presence of Lucy Letby during incidents. The handwritten notes. The Facebook searches. The expert testimony. Viewed individually, each piece of evidence may generate debate. Viewed collectively, supporters argue, they form a compelling and disturbing pattern. To them, the conclusion reached by the jury remains the correct one. But there is another side to the debate. Those who believe Lucy Letby may be innocent do not necessarily deny the tragedies that occurred inside the neonatal unit. Nor do they dismiss the suffering experienced by the families involved. Instead, they question whether the evidence presented at trial was interpreted correctly. One of the most significant areas of disagreement involves medical evidence. Several experts reviewing the case after the convictions have argued that alternative explanations may exist for some of the deaths and collapses. Complications associated with prematurity, infections, underlying medical conditions, treatment-related factors. According to these critics, some events presented as evidence of deliberate harm may have plausible medical explanations. Others focus on disagreements between experts themselves. Medicine is not always absolute. Specialists can examine the same records and arrive at different conclusions. The fact that respected experts continue to dispute aspects of the case has become a central argument for those calling for further review. There are also those who believe that ongoing legal efforts deserve careful consideration. The involvement of the Criminal Cases Review Commission, continuing expert analysis, and renewed public scrutiny have convinced some observers that important questions remain unanswered. To these critics, the existence of substantial professional disagreement means the case should remain open to re-examination. The result is a debate unlike almost any other. One side sees a convicted serial killer whose crimes were exposed through years of investigation and tested in court. The other sees a conviction that may one day be remembered as one of the most significant miscarriages of justice in modern British history. And perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Lucy Letby case is that both sides believe the evidence supports their position. The courts have reached a conclusion. Yet the public conversation continues. The legal verdict is established. The debate is not. As we reach the end of this story, one fact remains beyond dispute. 7 families lost children. Lives were changed forever. And regardless of where anyone stands on the controversy, the human tragedy at the center of this case should never be forgotten. Perhaps future investigations will reinforce the verdicts beyond all doubt. Perhaps future reviews will uncover new information. Or perhaps the questions surrounding the case will continue for years to come. For now, Lucy Letby remains behind bars. The convictions remain in force. The debate remains alive. And the question remains unanswered for many people around the world. What really happened inside the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital? Maybe history has already recorded the answer. Or maybe history is still waiting for it. If you've followed this case from the beginning, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you believe the evidence proves Lucy Letby's guilt beyond reasonable doubt? Or do you believe the ongoing questions deserve further examination? Share your perspective respectfully in the comments below. Cases like this often provoke strong opinions, but thoughtful discussion helps us better understand the facts, the evidence, and the difficult questions that remain. If you found this investigation informative, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a future case. Because here at Dark Crime Casefiles, we don't chase headlines. We follow the evidence. We examine the questions others overlook. And we shine a light on stories that continue to haunt the public long after the verdict has been delivered. Thank you for watching. And remember, no crime stays in the dark.